I have to say I'm a little embarrassed to follow up on such a brilliant performance that preceded this, and I feel like this whole talk is going to be such an anticlimax to everything that has preceded, but bear with me, maybe it'll be worth your while. I'm truly delighted to be at this venue tonight at the annual Ghadeer conference sponsored by the Imam Ali Research Center and the Hartford International University. At the very outset, I want to express my gratitude to Dr. Hussein Kamali, I think he's still here, and the organizing committee for inviting me to be part of this event. And I also want to give a special thanks to Dr. Noor Zahra Zaidi for taking care of all the complex logistics that are never ending, right? And that's expected for putting a conference of this nature together. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for being here tonight, and I hope we will have perhaps a little time for a conversation or discussion at the end. So the 13th and 14th centuries were among the most transformative periods in Islamic history. The Mongol invasions, culminating in the fall of Baghdad in 1258, brought an end to the Abbasid Caliphate and reconfigured the political and intellectual landscape of the Central Islamic lands. At the same time, new dynasties such as the Ilkhanids in Iran and Iraq, and the Mamluks in Syria and Egypt reshaped institutions of learning and patronage. Under the Ilkhanids, who ruled between 1256 to 1335, the political order in Iran and Iraq became religiously fluid, and their patronage policies shifted over time, which created both tension and opportunity. In the absence of a strong Sunni caliphate, Shia communities, especially the Twelver Shia in Iraq and Iran, found greater space to organize scholarly life. Cities such as Hilla emerged as major centers of Shia jurisprudence and theology. At the same time, Sunni scholars continued to teach, adjudicate, and write under Mongol rule. The Ilkhanid court employed scholars of various confessional backgrounds, and practical governance often demanded cooperation rather than sectarian exclusion. Although confessional boundaries were firmly etched, the scholarly culture of the period operated within a shared intellectual framework that enabled dialogue, mutual influence, and pragmatic coexistence to a certain degree. In his depiction of the Ilkhanid period, Michel Mazawi comments that it was marked by tremendous religious controversies, but at the same time it was a period of coexistence of the various Muslim religious views, end of quote. A central Shia figure in the early 14th century was Hassan ibn Yusuf ibn Ali ibn Mutahhar al-Hilli, better known as Al-Allama al-Hilli, and he died in 726 or 1325. Trained in Hilla, Al-Allama al-Hilli studied with both Shia and Sunni teachers and wrote extensively in theology and jurisprudence. His works addressed Sunni arguments in detail, demonstrating familiarity with Ash'ari and Maturidi positions. Importantly, al-Hilli participated in courtly debates under the Ilkhanids, where theological questions were not merely academic, but politically consequential. Many Sunni scholars of the 14th century also engaged Shia theology, even as they refuted some of its basic premises. The Hanbali theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 728 or 1328, composed a work known as the Minhaj al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyya as a rebuttal to Shia arguments, particularly those articulated by his contemporary Al-Allama al-Hilli. While polemical in tone, Ibn Taymiyyah's work reflects deep engagement with Shia sources. He quoted extensively from Shia texts and responded systematically to their claims. Such polemics presuppose shared standards of textual evidence and rational argumentation. The very nature of these debates reveals a form of intellectual interdependence. Shia theologians adopted methods developed in Sunni kalam, especially in logic and dialectics. Sunni scholars, in turn, were compelled to grapple with Shia formulations of the imamate and divine justice. Theological disagreement has often functioned within a common scholarly framework. Although Hadith scholarship often reinforced sectarian boundaries, given disputes over transmitters and chains of authority, it also involved methodological convergence. Shia Hadith scholarship shows considerable overlap in the criteria devised for evaluating narrators and the soundness of reports with Sunni Hadith scholarship because of the strong influence exerted by the latter over the former. Shia Hadith scholars borrowed the evaluation criteria developed by Sunni scholars, for which they added an additional category, as I will be discussing very shortly. The science of Rijal, the biographical evaluation of transmitters, also flourished in both traditions. One of the topics that continued to invite mutual Sunni-Shia engagement well into the 13th and 14th centuries is the one that had created the fundamental fissure between these two groups. The topic of political governance of the Muslim Ummah, that is to say, concerning the caliphate or the imamate, the khilafah or the imama. Some of these differences regarding legitimate leadership became even more accentuated in this later period. When Shia scholars debated their Sunni counterparts on this topic, they did not appeal to the concept of nas, referring to the concept of the divine appointment of the Imams as the only rulers over the community, or to the Ghadeer incident that we're celebrating today, which, unlike Sunnis, they interpret as mandating the selection of Ali as the Prophet Muhammad's rightful successor. Instead, they frequently adopted the theological and political vocabularies of the Sunnis in conversation with them. For example, they often argued their case in favor of Ali's superior claim to the caliphate or imamate, primarily on the basis of his greater moral excellences and precedences in rendering services to Islam, rather than on his blood kinship to the Prophet, as became the classical legitimist position among the Shia. Shia theological works, in fact, came to enumerate and describe these qualities essential for effective legitimate leadership in great detail, as did similar Sunni works on the caliphate. A study of this distinctive fada'il or manaqib literature, and as I mentioned in my slide, this refers to the literature on the moral excellences of the companions of the Prophet, allows us to establish that the key traits of precedence in embracing Islam and the possession of a constellation of moral excellences constantly undergirded discussions of the most excellent leader, Imam Afdal of the polity. As some of you may know, I researched this topic in my dissertation and in my first published monograph, in the course of which I examined an important work composed by less well-known Imami Shi'i author, Ahmad ibn Tawus, who died in 673 or 1274 from Hilla, who lived and flourished in the 7th or 13th century. And Ibn Tawus's life and intellectual output are highly illustrative of the intellectual and theological trends prevalent in the middle and later later half of the 13th century, when he was most productive. In the rest of our presentation, I will provide an account of, first of all, his views on the imamate, especially as it pertains to the possession of what we may call soteriological and esoteric knowledge by the imam of the age, and secondly, Ibn Tawus's pioneering work in the field of Shia Hadith scholarship, both produced in the context of active Sunni-Shia shared academic and intellectual endeavors that were a distinctive feature of the time. But first, let me introduce Jamal-ud-Din ibn Tawus. and it didn't move. Oh, maybe I should go down. Is that what I should do? Yes, there we go. Jamaluddin Abul Fadail Ahmed ibn Tawus al-Alawi al-Hassani al-Hilli was, as his nisbah suggests, from Hilla in central Iraq, and a scion of the prominent and learned Shia family of Tawus, which claimed descent from al-Hassan, the eldest son of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Al-Allam al-Hilli said the following about Ibn Tawus, his teacher, and I'm now quoting from him. Our hallowed master and great Imam, a faqih from among the Ahlul Bayt, Jamaluddin Abul Fadail, died in the year 673. He was an author and a mujtahid and the most illustrious personage of his time. He granted me the ijazah to relate all his works and reports. He was an eloquent poet, profound, creative, and masterly. End of quote. Ibn Tawus was indeed a prolific author, and is said to have written more than 80 books. He studied with prominent scholars in Hilla, including Sheikh Najibuddin Muhammad ibn Nama al-Hilli, Sayyid Safiyuddin Muhammad al-Ha'iri, and others. Although the sources do not mention any Sunni scholar that Ibn Tawus studied with, it is clear that he must have, or at the very least, been very familiar with their works, particularly on the topic of Hadith sciences, which I will explain a bit later why I think that is the case. Let me now go on to a discussion of the special esoteric knowledge that the Shia believe is a prerogative of the rightful Imam of the age, and that is something that he should possess in abundance. Both Sunni and Shia conceptions of legitimate leadership are in fact grounded in the possession of ilm, referring to both religious and practical knowledge. In this discourse on the most excellent leadership, not only is possession of ilm of paramount importance, but also its provenance, its source. Knowledge derived from close association with the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, the first-hand auditing of his statements, personal observation, and mimetic reminiscences of his actions, constitutes a significant part of true and normative ilm. Ibn Tawus had much to say on this point in his major treatise, Bina al-Maqala al-Fatimiyya fi Naqd Risalat al-Uthmaniyya, which can be translated as the composition of the Fatimid treatise in criticism of the Risalat al-Uthmaniyya, and I'll explain a little bit later what the Risalat al-Uthmaniyya is. And he completed this work after the Mongol conquest of 656 or 1258. As the title indicates, this work was written as a robust rebuttal to the pro-Sunni arguments of the famous 3rd or 9th century bel-lettrist Amr ibn Bahr al-Jahiz, who died in 255 or 869, as detailed in his treatise known as the Risalat al-Uthmaniyya. So this is the Risala, or the treatise, that Ibn Tawus is composing his refutation of. So in this work, dealing with the topic of the caliphate or the imamate, al-Jahiz, in his own work, posits the superior qualities of Abu Bakr in particular, and to a lesser extent of Umar ibn al-Khattab, vis-a-vis Ali ibn Abi Talib, particularly when the extent of their religion and practical knowledge are concerned. As might be expected, Ibn Tawus takes considerable umbrage at this position and hastens to address this point in the Bina al-Maqala. And he states, and now it's a direct quote from his work, "As for intellect and power of retention, they were the crowning glory of our master, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, God's blessings be upon him, to which his famous sermons and blessed eloquence bear witness. It is known that the famous companion Ibn Abbas, who was known for his exceptionally retentive mind, had praised Ali as the most intelligent man he had ever met, and one endowed with an exceptional memory. No one denies this," continues Ibn Tawus, "except the obstinate, the reprobate, or the one who is ignorant of the ways of knowledge, or a deviant." End of quote. Ibn Tawus emphasized in particular the esoteric and intuitive aspect of ilm, which was granted to Ali as a special dispensation. He states that Quran exegetes and scholars who are not one of us, that is to say, those of the Sunni persuasion, have themselves attested to Ali's superior access to esoteric and specialized knowledge unmatched by any other companion. Ibn Tawus refers to a report quoted by the Hanafi scholar Abu Muayyad al-Muwaffaq al-Khwarizmi, who died in 568 or 1172, which glorifies the extent of Ali's knowledge. In this report, the Prophet states, one who wishes to look at Adam for his knowledge, at Noah for his understanding, at Yahya ibn Zakaria for his abstinence, and at Musa ibn Imran for his valor, let him look at Ali ibn Abi Talib. End of quote. Another fairly common report is cited by Ibn Tawus, related by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, which states that wisdom has been divided into 10 parts. Ali had been given 9 parts, while the remaining part was distributed among the rest of humanity. Ali was the vessel of the Prophet's knowledge, for he knew whatever the Prophet knew. A well-known hadith narrated by Ibn Abbas and much invoked in Shia and Sufi circles states, I am the house of wisdom, and Ali is its gate. So whoever desires wisdom, let him approach the gate. On the basis of all these reports, Ibn Tawus criticizes the position of his nemesis, Al-Jahiz, who had maintained that Abu Bakr was more knowledgeable than Ali in general. How can that be, he asks, since Ali had been given 9 parts of wisdom and had been declared to be the vessel of the Prophet's knowledge? That would be the equivalent of saying that Abu Bakr is more knowledgeable than the Prophet himself, and that is tantamount to unbelief. He then proceeds to support this assertion by referring to a hadith narrated by Aisha, in which the Prophet says, quote, the truth is with Ali, and the two will not part until they come to me at the trough, the Hawd. Besides the Prophet, some of his most prominent companions and relatives testify to the superior wisdom of Ali. Among them are Umar ibn Khattab, Sa'id ibn Musayyab, Aisha, Ibn Abbas, and Ibn Mas'ud. Ali's access to esoteric and specialized knowledge is described as having been pivotal in his interpretation of the Quran and its commentary, at-ta'wil wa tafsir. Ibn Tawus refers to the well-known Andalusian Sunni scholar Ibn Abdul Barr, who died in 463 or 1070, who reported the following from the companion Abu Tufail, and this would be the last companion, Abu Tufail Amir ibn Wathil al-Kinani, who died in 728, quoting, I saw Ali making a speech, and he said, ask me, for by God you have only to ask me about something, and I will inform you about the book of God. By God, there is no verse regarding which I do not know, whether it came down at night or during the day, upon the plains or upon the mountains. End of quote. For Ibn Tawus, Ali is thus without peer in Islam after the Prophet because of the unique knowledge that inheres ontologically in him and in his progeny, in whose hereditary and privileged nature no other companion can claim a share. Worthy of note is that Ibn Tawus draws upon hadiths from primarily Sunni collections to drive this point home. For good measure, these hadiths are attributed to first-generation Muslims like Aisha and Omar, as I've mentioned, who are sometimes portrayed in Shia literature as not having been favorably disposed to Ali and the Ahlul Bayt. The hadith, I'm the house of wisdom and Ali is its gate, so whoever desires wisdom, let him approach the gate, is understood by the Shia as asserting that Ali alone was privy to privileged and esoteric knowledge. On the basis of this and other hadiths, many among the Shia came to attribute special thaumaturgic powers or miraculous powers to him. Professor Hussein Modarresi has pointed out that the belief in the Imam's abilities to perform miracles grew due to the strong influence of the extremist group Al-Mufawwida, who subscribed to such essentially what was later deemed to be a hulu, or extreme beliefs. The Mufawwida were so called because they believed that God had empowered the Prophet and the Imams to carry out certain functions that were otherwise divine prerogatives, such as the creation of and provision for beings, and even the abrogation of the Sharia. This delegation of divine authority and functions came to be known as tafweed, and the proponents of this concept were those called the Mufawwida. Hadiths emanating from them that emphasized the supernatural faculties of the Imams made their way into standard Hadith compilations, such as the famous Al-Kafi of the 4th-10th century scholar Al-Kulaini, who died in 329 or 941. And the Kitab al-Kafi, as many of you will know, is one of the 4 canonical Imami Hadith collections. They also made their way into the later popular Hadith collection known as the Bihar al-Anwar by Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, and he died in the 17th century. But especially in the 3rd, 9th century, when the Mufawwida were the most powerful, they drowned out the voices of the more moderate camp, as Professor Hussein Mudarrisi describes it, who tended to eschew such beliefs. And in fact, such beliefs were repudiated by later Imami scholars such as Shaykh al-Mufid and Shaykh al-Tusi. These views had not completely died out in the 13th and 14th centuries, and we see their influence on Ibn Tawus's work. In fact, the extent of Ali's knowledge and the question of whether it included knowledge of future events and of the occult remain to this day a much debated question among Shia theologians. In general, the Shia maintained that Ali, as well as the subsequent Imams, had knowledge of the unseen, al-ghaib, but there's a lack of agreement on what kind of knowledge this referred to. In one report, Ali provides a definition of ilm al-ghaib, the knowledge of the unseen, and its extent as follows, quoting, "Knowledge of the unseen is the knowledge of the hour, and what God the Almighty has reckoned, according to his saying, indeed with God is the knowledge of the hour," an ayah that occurs in Surat Luqman, in Quran 31, verse 34. Continuing the quote, "It is he, exalted is he, who knows what is in the wombs, male or female, comely or uncomely, generous or miserly, happy or wretched, who is destined for hell as firewood, or as a companion for the prophets in paradise. This," Ali continues, "is knowledge of the unseen, and none knows it save God. Whatever is besides that, he taught it to his prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, and he taught it to me and prayed for me that my heart," literally the breast, "would be able to encompass it, and my limbs would be able to bear it," end of quote. It is further reported that Abu Ja'far, which is the kunya for Muhammad al-Baqir, the 5th Imam, who died in 114 or 732, would distinguish between the general and special knowledge of God, ilm am wa khas. According to him, the former kind of knowledge has been granted to the angels, the prophets, and us, meaning the 12 Imams, while the latter, which includes knowledge of the hour, the future, etc., is God's alone. An important part of such privileged knowledge conferred upon the Imams was referred to as the knowledge of deaths or destinies and trials, al-manaya wal-balaya. Nu'aym ibn Hammad, who lived in the 9th century, is reported to have said that Ali possessed knowledge of all the schisms, the fitan, that would occur until the last hour. Al-Allam al-Hilli affirms that Ali had knowledge of future events and that he foretold his own death and the tragedy at Al-Karbala, among other events. The Sunni response to the Shia emphasis on what Professor Amir Mu'azzi has referred to as higher intelligence, or sacred intelligence, is predicated on the debate as to whether the office of the caliph or imam was conceived of from the outset as a religious office or merely a political office. Where one landed on this debate would hinge on the conceptualization of the nature of the knowledge attributed to the caliph or the imam. Traditional Sunni sources attribute superior knowledge of both the mundane, to be construed as worldly, and political savoir-faire, and of the religious law to the Sunni Rashidun caliphs. In this depiction, the first four caliphs were both lawmakers and law enforcers, since they ruled both by observing prophetic precedent and, in the absence of such precedent, by personal interpretation of the Quran and Hadith. Engaging in legal decision-making, an activity that would later be termed fiqh, in itself does not seem to have stamped the office as inherently religious, since such juridical activity is portrayed as falling within the normal sphere of what a temporal ruler of a religious polity might be expected to do, as might any other learned adult Muslim. In Sunni conceptualization, the average believer theoretically had or could have access to the same pool of knowledge that the caliph or imam had. The latter, however, would be able to process this information better and apply it more effectively in appropriate circumstances that would contribute to the welfare of the polity as a whole. In this vein, Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century rejects the general Shia understanding of the Hadith, I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate, characterizing it as one of the forged and false traditions. يُعَدُّ هذا الحديث في الموضوعات المخدوبات. Even though At-Tirmidhi, the Sunni Hadith compiler, had included it in his Sunan. Maybe I should, in the interest of time, maybe skip a little bit here and move on. It should be noted that some attempts were made in the later period to impute to Abu Bakr and Omar access to privileged ilm in response to Shiite claims of higher intelligence for their imams. I think it's important to emphasize this point, that both Sunnis and the Shia are talking to one another and borrowing sometimes talking points from the other. And they try to come up with responses using the same vocabulary that would be meaningful to the other side. So for example, in one such Fadail report that circulated among the Sunnis, states that Abu Bakr was the most gifted in the interpretation of dreams. A variant report mentions that the Basran successor, Muhammad ibn Sirin, who died in 110 or 728, had commented that Abu Bakr was the most skilled in onaromancy after the Prophet. One account mentions that Omar predicted his own martyrdom while visiting the grave of Abu Bakr. That, of course, is meant to be reminiscent of the report in which Ali himself predicts his own death. These reports, however, appear not to have entered the mainstream among the Sunnis and did not significantly alter the ascription of a more pedestrian kind of knowledge to the Sunni caliphs. Let me now move on to the topic of Hadith studies. As I already mentioned, Ibn Tawus was responsible for a significant development in Hadith criticism and classification, for which he has earned himself a unique niche in Shia ilm al-Hadith. According to his student Al-Allam al-Hilla, Ibn Tawus coined new terminology for hadiths, and this method of hadith classification then came to be widely used in Imami jurisprudence. Following Ibn Tawus's method of classification, hadiths in Imami Shiaism are grouped into four main categories, three of which are common to both Sunni and Imami Shia system of hadith classification, based primarily on analysis of the isnad, the chain of transmitters, as follows. So the first category is sahih, which means sound. According to Sunni definition, this type of report regarding whose soundness there is no doubt must be attributed to the Prophet and reported by men and women considered to be highly reliable transmitters in an unbroken chain of transmission. From the Imami Shia viewpoint, a Sahih report can be attributed to one of the 12 Imams as well, for the Imams, like the Prophet, were infallible. The chain of transmission of such reports must, without interruption, reach back to a companion of the Prophet, or in Shia Islam, also reach back to a companion of one of the Imams. Similar to Sunni requirements, the narrators of Sahih reports must be of flawless reputation and of unimpeachable integrity. The second category is Hasan, which means good. In both Sunni and Shia ilm al-Hadith, these are hadiths very close in rank to the Sahih reports. Only minor defects are perceived in the narrators of such types of hadiths. The third category is al-Muwaththaq, which I'm translating as trustworthy or reliable. And this is a category that occurs in Shia ilm al-Hadith only. A Muwaththaq report is one narrated through a chain of transmitters that includes the names of reliable but non-Imami authorities. Its text might even be at variance with that of a Sahih report. But in general, Hasan and Muwaththaq reports are considered very reliable, for they are only a notch below Sahih reports. And finally, the fourth category is da'if, or weak. In both Sunni and Shia hadith sciences, when a report cannot be attributed to an infallible source, or it is transmitted by authorities of questionable integrity, or its chain of transmission is interrupted, it is considered weak and unreliable. Such hadiths are generally not considered valid for forming legal decisions. Before this method of hadith classification, Shia scholars classified hadith into only two categories: Sahih reports, that is to say those that are attributed to the Imams, and Da'if reports, that is to say those that are not. Basically, reports found in the four canonical Shia hadith compilations known as Al-Kutub al-Arba'a, the four books, were all considered to be Sahih. Those not included in these works were considered to be Da'if. This remained the akhbari attitude toward hadith classification, while the isnad-based analysis of hadith was embraced by scholars later considered to be among the usuliyun. The reason for this overlap between Sunni and Shia classification of hadiths is that hadith criticism in Imami Shiaism, as I mentioned earlier, was strongly influenced by Sunni methodology. Al-Hurr al-Amili, who died in the 17th century, he was a prominent Imami Shia Akhbari scholar and jurist, mentions in his biographical notices on Al-Allama al-Hilli and Al-Shahid al-Thani, another very well-known scholar but from the 16th century, and they are two of the most important traditionists in Shia Islam, that they studied under both Sunni and Shia teachers. So these are well corroborated, and they occur in these biographical works that were carefully compiled by later scholars. It is not clear if Ibn Tawus himself studied with Sunni scholars, which would have explained the provenance of his hadith methodology. It is very likely he did, but his biographers list the names only of men known to be Shia scholars. We know that his brother, Radiuddin Ali ibn Musa ibn Tawus, who died in 664 or 1266, studied with Sunni teachers, for he transmitted from them, and he had asserted, the brother had asserted, that there was actual benefit in it for them. So we should not be surprised or look askance at the fact that during this period, the Shia scholars and Sunni scholars are actually studying with one another and learning a lot from one another. And this is something we need to keep in the back of our heads when we discuss this period. Now, one of these teachers of Radiuddin, the brother, Radiuddin Ali ibn Musa ibn Tawus, was the Sunni traditionist and historian Muhibbuddin Muhammad ibn Mahmud, known as Ibn Najjar al-Baghdadi al-Shafi'i. And he's the author of the famous work, Dhail Tarikh Baghdad. We also know that Ahmed ibn Tawus' son, Ghiyaduddin Abdul Karim, studied with Sunni teachers. There was thus no apparent ideological bias against this practice. Why similar documentation is lacking for Ibn Tawus, Jamaluddin ibn Tawus, is somewhat puzzling, since we can't detect an obvious Sunni influence upon him. Now, previously, it was thought that Al-Allama al-Hilli had inaugurated the quadripartite system of hadith classification that I just described to you. To Professor Hossein Modarisi belongs the credit of being the first to point out that this classification actually originated with Jamaluddin Ahmad ibn Tawus. Al-Allama al-Hilli made this system of hadith classification widely known through his legal works, which met with strong resistance from the Akhbariyun. Some of the Akhbaris detested this innovation so much that they went so far as to claim that religion had been destroyed on 2 occasions. The first being when this novel method of hadith classification had been introduced, and the second being the day when Al-Allama al-Hilli had been born. That had been this very severe and harsh criticism, as you can imagine. One of the most vocal opponents of this new hadith system was Muhammad Amin ibn Muhammad Sharif al-Akhbari al-Asrabadi, who died in 1036 or 1627. And he is recognized as the founder of the later Akhbari school and author of the work Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah. He inveighed against the 4-part hadith system of classification made popular by the rationalists, whom he refers to as al-Mutaakhirun, the later scholars. Namely, and to this group belongs, in his mind, Al-Allama al-Hilli, al-Shahid al-Awwal, al-Shahid al-Thani, his son Hassan ibn Zainuddin al-Amili, and al-Sheikh Bahauddin al-Amili, spanning the 13th through the 17th centuries. Al-Asrabadi states that the one who initiated this system, and this would be Ibn Tawus, although it's not clear that he actually knew this. So he said that the one who initiated the system did so because he had no regard for the sayings of past generations, al-Qudama. And the reason for his lack of regard was that his mind, this is a direct quote now from Al-Asrabadi, was that his mind was steeped only in the books of the common people, the Amma, and this is an epithet for the Sunnis, as opposed to the books containing the sayings and practices of the Imams. However, this quadripartite system of hadith classification survived this opposition in order and became very widespread and prevalent in later centuries. Ibn Tawus utilizes these principles of ilm al-hadith in the Bina al-Maqala to establish the validity of hadiths which demonstrate the supremacy of Ali's position in Islam after the Prophet and his superior qualifications for the caliphate over Abu Bakr. And this counters the polemical arguments advanced by Al-Jahiz in his Risalatul Uthmaniyah and the hadith-based evidence that Al-Jahiz presents to establish the validity of Abu Bakr's superior claim to the caliphate. Ibn Tawus, first and foremost, is concerned with establishing the reliability of transmitters and the nature of the chain of transmission. That is essentially whether it is broken or continuous for a particular hadith, and to establish what is known in hadith terminology as its tawatur. And tawatur refers to the widespread dissemination of a particular report. This kind of analysis, according to Ibn Tawus, is crucial for determining the reliability of hadiths and their acceptability for use as polemical proofs. Ibn Tawus stressed the point that it is actually irrelevant whether a narrator of hadith is Shia or Sunni. In fact, he appears to take great pains in establishing the identity of those narrators who are not, as he calls it, one of us, min ghayrina, that is those who are Sunnis, but they happen to be such authorities. Sunni authorities are above moral reproach and above all well-disposed towards the family of the Prophet, towards the Ahlul Bayt. Therefore, Ibn Tawus quotes hadiths frequently that have been transmitted and or recorded by Sunni scholars like Al-Thalabi, Ibn Abdul Barr al-Maghribi, whom I referred to before, Abu Nu'aym, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, and the authors of the 6 Sunni canonical hadith compilations, Al-Bukhari, Muslim ibn Hajjaj, Al-Nasa'i, Al-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and Abu Dawud, as well as Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So he refers to these Sunni authorities freely throughout his treatise. Ibn Tawus, however, readily discounts the report of any narrator, like the 2nd, 8th century Kufan historian and jurist Amir ibn Sharahil Ash-Sha'bi, who is known to have harbored ill will towards the Ahlul Bayt, or is known to have consorted with the Umayyads, the sworn enemies of the Alids. Al-Jahiz is also disqualified as a hadith narrator on account of what Ibn Tawus characterizes as his malice towards Ali. For whoever is of this disposition, says Ibn Tawus, his claims are not to be accepted and his accounts are to be strenuously rejected. Moreover, any hadith related by a member of the family of Abdullah ibn Zubayr is not to be trusted, for the family of Zubayr was hostile to the Ahlul Bayt. With regard to women narrators, Aisha is the most often quoted. The following 4 women who related the Ghadeer Khum tradition were also declared to be reliable transmitters. Fatima bin Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's cousin; Salama, the daughter of Abu Umayyah ibn al-Mughira and wife of the Prophet; Hani, the daughter of Abu Talib and Ali's sister; and Asma bint Umais al-Khata'miyah, who later married Ali. It is interesting to note that since the Bina al-Maqala was written with a Sunni audience in mind, relatively few hadiths are quoted on the authority of Shia sources. To sum up then, even in this brief survey of the role that the possession of ilm, defined as both religious and mundane knowledge, played in establishing the bona fides of candidates for the position of the caliph or imam, it becomes obvious that there developed over time distinctive conceptualizations of the nature of this knowledge among the Shia and the Sunnis. In classic Shia conceptualization of legitimate leadership, the knowledge of the caliph or imam had to exceed, even bypass, that of the ordinary persons. Thus, it could only be obtained by special divine dispensation. Religious knowledge invested in the Shia imam is ontological. He is the repository, the storehouse of this privileged knowledge because of his blood kinship with the Prophet himself. The imam's followers, and thus the true believers, have access to this knowledge only through his mediation. For the believer, membership in the Shia salvific community, headed by the morally impeccable imam, who converses with angels, muhaddath, and is given to understand much that is denied the rest of humanity, mufaham, is thus mandatory. One Shia gloss on the word amma, which refers to the Sunni commonality, links it etymologically to al-Umi, the community of the blind, bereft as it is of inspired, infallible leadership. From this perspective, classic Shia attribution of extraordinary knowledge of supernatural provenance to the imam imparts to the imamate undeniable religious charisma. In particular this sense, the Shia imamate bears little affinity to the conventional Sunni conception of the caliphate that can at most assign superior understanding and efficacious application of the religious law to the caliph, but does not make him the recipient of exclusive esoteric knowledge. With regard to Ibn Tawus' seminal contribution to Shia ilm al-Hadith, his receptivity to knowledge production by Sunni scholars made this possible. He adroitly uses Sunni Hadith methodology to discredit reports with anti-Alid content by casting doubt on the reliability of specific narrators within the chain of transmission, while promoting those that bolster his pro-Alid position. Thus, he participates robustly in an important hadith-based discourse between Shia and Sunni scholars on what constitutes legitimate leadership, excavating not only points of difference, but also common ground that both groups could subscribe to willingly and sincerely. The 13th and 14th centuries were clearly not an era of sectarian harmony, but neither were they defined solely by division. Political upheaval, especially under Mongol rule, disrupted established hierarchies and created new spaces for interaction. Ultimately, the scholarly culture of the 13th and 14th centuries reveals a complex interplay of rivalry and reciprocity. Cooperation did not erase doctrinal differences, but it enabled a dynamic scholarly environment in which Shia and Sunni thinkers contributed jointly, sometimes consciously, sometimes indirectly, to the development of Islamic thought as a whole. The period stands as a witness to the resilience of scholarly institutions and the capacity of learned communities to maintain academic exchange in the midst of rapid political transformation. And given our own fractious circumstances in contemporary academia, particularly in the West today, perhaps we can derive some hope from this period. So thank you very much for your attention.